far. Analytics plays a critical role in business, as well as a variety of other industries like finance, sports, government, etc. The study of analytics often involves historical data to look for potential trends of the past to understand the effects of certain decisions and evaluate the performance of the businesses. There are 4 types of analytics. Namely, descriptive, which explains what has happened. Predictive, which depicts what could happen. Diagnostic, which determines why it happened. And prescriptive, which talks about what should happen. Business analytics can be divided into several types, such as customer analytics, financial analytics, performance analytics, and risk analytics. The sort and filter functionalities are available in Excel to order or filter the data for further analysis. Group by functionality in Excel allows us to show necessary data for easy viewing and analysis. The ungroup option allows us to remove the groups created by group. While removing duplicates, we can choose single or multiple columns to check the data. Data validation, on the other hand, applies only to new data entered in the cells where rules are placed. Formatting helps format the data using different techniques, making the data easy to read and analyze. Formatting techniques apply to the worksheet to help users present data efficiently. Whereas, conditional formatting helps the users to apply formatting to specific cells so that the data makes more sense. Excel provides many logical, statistical, and mathematical functions, such as VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, quartile, etc. Logical functions evaluate a cell or cells for certain criteria and return a Boolean value as true or false. The statistical and mathematical functions help users manage data, perform descriptive statistical analysis, and perform calculations ranging from basic to complex scenarios. The reference functions index, match, and offset return the relative position and value in a single-dimensional array. Hello, and welcome to the lesson, Analyzing Data with Pivot Tables. Being able to analyze all the data in our worksheet can help us make better business decisions. But sometimes it's hard to know where to start, especially when we have a lot of data. Suppose we want to determine the net sales in each region in the given table. Analyzing this manually could be difficult as region appears in multiple rows, and we need to total them individually. We can also determine net sales using Excel's built-in formulas, a task that could become quite time-consuming. Here, a pivot table comes into the picture and helps extract key information from this large detailed dataset. A pivot table is an incredibly powerful tool that makes it easy to summarize, analyze, explore, and present the data. A pivot table makes life easy, giving us insights into the data and allowing us to experiment with it to discover new trends and patterns. It can instantly calculate and summarize data in a way that's both easy to read and manipulate. One can easily design a pivot table by simply dragging and dropping relevant information into the appropriate boxes. In this lesson, we will learn about pivot tables, how to create them in Excel, and how to design them according to requirements. Before going into details, let us start this lesson by defining its objectives. In this lesson, we will learn about pivot table and analyze data with pivot table. Michael has been assigned to create a report that requires him to use the pivot table tool in Excel. To complete the project, he has to learn to use pivot tables and create them in Excel. Group 2 different data types in a pivot table. Create and evaluate the summarized values in a pivot table. Illustrate the use of calculated field and calculated item. And design interactive pivot table using a slicer. Now, let us learn about pivot tables. Pivot tables are very useful and powerful features of Excel. They can be used to summarize, analyze, explore, and present data in tabular form. Consider the given sample sales data, which includes the following data fields: dates, order ID, product, salesman, region, number of customers, net sales, and profit and loss. Let's say we want to determine the net sales done by the salesman in each region. Analyzing this manually would be time-consuming and difficult, as the data for each region appears on multiple rows, and we would need a total of all different orders individually. Here, PivotTable comes into play and becomes a lifesaver. This data can be analyzed easily by creating a pivot table. The feature allows us to calculate and summarize data instantly, which is both easy to read and manipulate. Once we've created a pivot table, we can quickly pivot or reorganize data to answer different questions. Let us now understand how to create pivot tables in Excel. Now, let us look at how to create a pivot table. To create a pivot table in Excel, select the cells containing the data we want to use. Click the Insert tab and select the Pivot Table option. The Create Pivot Table dialog box appears. Under Table Range, reference box, Excel automatically selects the data range that we want to use to create the pivot table. There is also an option asking for the placement of the pivot table. This feature allows us to decide whether we would like to place the pivot table in a new worksheet or at a particular location in the existing worksheet. Here, we will select a new worksheet and click OK. After clicking OK, Excel creates a new workbook with a blank pivot table and a pivot table fields box on the right side of the workbook. If we are not able to see the pivot table fields box, then right-click the pivot table and select the Show Fields list. The pivot table field list box contains two sections, namely a field section and an area section. The field section allows us to pick the fields required to create a pivot table. Area section allows us to arrange the fields the way we want them to be displayed in the pivot table. Now let's create a pivot table to determine the region-wise net sales within the pivot table field list tasks pane. First, drag the salesman field into the area marked rows. Then drag the region field into the area marked as columns. Lastly, drag the net sales field into the area marked as calculated values. Here, we can see that the pivot table is populated with the net sales done by the salesman in each region. Like any normal spreadsheet, any type of number formatting can be applied. Now, if we would like to see the total number of sales instead of the net sales, then we should change the sum of sales function to the count of sales. To change this function, right-click the Value field and click the Value field settings. In Summarize Values field by dialog box, select Count function and click OK. By using this function, we can easily determine the total number of sales done by each salesman. Let's now study the next topic: grouping in pivot table. It is often useful to group the fields in the pivot table by the header values. Grouping data in a pivot table allows us to group the data for any field added as a row or column. Excel can do this automatically for numeric values, including dates and time. Let us understand this concept in detail with the help of an example. Let us now look at an example for grouping pivot tables in Excel. Consider the same sample sales data used earlier. Let's say we would like to determine the month-wise and year-wise net sales. To do this, we will use the group feature. First, let us create the pivot table showing the sales figure for each date. Select the required data. First, click on A1 and press Ctrl Shift down arrow key. In the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table command. The Create Pivot Table dialog box appears. Under Table Range reference box, Excel automatically selects the data range. Then click OK. To create a pivot table for sales representing each date, drag the Dates field in the Rows area and the Net Sales field in Calculated Values area. Here, a pivot table is created, which shows the date-wise sales figures. Now to group the data month-wise, right-click the leftmost column of the pivot table, representing the dates, and select the option group. A grouping dialog box appears. In this dialog box, under By Section, select Months, and click OK. Now, the data is grouped month-wise. Now to group the data year-wise. Once again right-click the leftmost column of the pivot table, representing the dates, and select the option group. A grouping dialog box appears. In this dialog box, under By Section, select Years, and click OK. You can now see that the data in this pivot table has been grouped month-wise and year-wise. Let us take another example. We will use the same sample sales data. Now we need to create a pivot table that groups the sales amount in an interval of 1,000 sales items according to the number of sales. Let's begin by creating the pivot table. Select the required data. First, click on A1 and press Ctrl, Shift, right. Now press Ctrl, Shift, down arrow key. In the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table command. The Create the Pivot Table in the dialog box appears. Under the Table Range Reference box, Pivot Table in the dialog Excel automatically selects the data range. Under the Table Range Reference click box, OK. Excel automatically selects the data range. Then click OK. To create a pivot table, drag net sales field in the rows area and again the calculated field's value. To see the total number of sales, we need to change the sum function to the count function. Right-click the value field and then click the value field setting. In Summarize By dialog box, select Count function and click OK. The pivot table created portrays the number of sales according to the sales amount. To group this data, right-click the row field and select the option group. A grouping dialog box appears. In this dialog box, enter the start, end, and interval values. Here we will enter the start value as 1300, the end value as 15,000, and the interval value as 1000. This will group the sales amount, beginning with the class interval 1,300 to 2,299. Up to 15,300. Thus the grouping feature helps us create a table with class intervals and the number of values in each class intervals. Let us now move on to the next topic. Custom calculation. Sometimes there's a need to change the way the values are displayed in the pivot table. For example, we might want to display the value in terms of a percentage instead of a total, or average the values instead of summing them. To see how this can be done in Excel, let's consider the pivot table we created earlier. Here, the pivot table depicts the net sales done by the salesman in each region. Now we need to visualize the values as a percentage or depict the net sales in the region as a percentage of the grand total. To do this, right-click in the Value Area section and select Show Values as option. Select the option Percentage of Grand Total from the list displayed. The pivot table will change the values into the percentage of the grand total. In this way, we can easily check the percentage values of the sales in each region. There are different options available in Show Values as options like percentage of column total, percentage of row total, or difference from value and so on, which can be used according to our requirement. Next, we will learn about calculated field and calculated item features. Once we have created a pivot table, we can add calculated fields and calculated items in it. These features help us enhance the results by allowing us to write our own formulas. This functionality helps create a new field in the table that performs the calculations based on other pivot fields. Let us understand how to use these fields with the help of an example. Let us now look at an example of calculated field. Consider the given pivot table. Here, we need to distribute the incentives to salespeople based on their net sales amount. If sales are more than 1,200,000, we should give 0.5% of net sales as an incentive, else no incentive shall be given. To perform this task, an extra field needs to be added to the current pivot table. This is done with the help of a calculated field feature. To add a new field to the pivot table, select a cell in the pivot table. Click the Analyze tab, select Field, Item and Sets, and then select the option Calculated Field. An Insert Calculated Field dialog box appears. Type the name of the calculated field as incentive. Then write the logical formula in the formula text box. Type equal, if, and open bracket. Then type net sales. After that, type greater than symbol, then type 1,200,000, comma, net sales and add multiply symbol, 0.05. Finally add, comma, and type 0 by dragging net sales field from the fields box. Then, click OK. This will create a new field named incentive in the field list. In this way, we can create a new calculated field in the pivot table. Now, let us look into calculated item. We can also add one or more calculated items in the pivot table field apart from the existing items. Calculated items are used to perform calculations between items within the fields. Consider the given pivot table. Here we want to compare the sales within different regions. Let's say we want to compare the net sales for the following regions simultaneously. North versus West, West versus Middle, Middle versus North. This can be done easily by inserting the calculated items in the pivot table. In the Analyze tab, click Field, Item, and Sets, and then select the calculated item. An Insert Calculated Item dialog box appears. Here you are required to create 3 new columns for the region. For that, select Region in the Field section. In the Name text box, enter the name as North versus West. Then write the logical formula in the formula text box. Take the formula as equals North by West by dragging the North and West column into the formula's text box. Repeat the steps in the other comparisons as well. That is West versus Middle. And Middle versus North. After completing this action, you will see that 3 new columns have been inserted into the pivot table to perform the comparative analysis between the regions. Now, let us move on to the topic slicer. Sometimes, depending on the need and the reason for the data analysis, the focus is required on just a specific section of the data. The filters feature available in Excel makes it quite easy to narrow down the data in the pivot table, extracting the required information. In this topic, we will study about the easy-to-use filtering components, known as slicers. Slicers contain a set of buttons which make filtering data in pivot tables easier and quicker. We do not have to open the drop-down box list to find the items we want to filter. We can create slices for any field and can filter the pivot table by selecting the type of data we want. Let us learn how to create a slicer. Consider the given pivot table. Suppose we want to analyze the sales for different regions and present the net sales done by each salesman in the form of a pivot report. You can do this with the help of slicers. Slicers can help us analyze the data quickly for 2 different regions. Let us now add slicers for the region field. To add a slicer, select any cell in the pivot table. From the Analysis tab under the Filter section, click the command, Insert Slicer. An Insert Slicer dialog box appears. Select the desired field. In our example, we will use the region checkbox and click OK. You can see the slicer appears right next to the pivot table. Each selected item is highlighted in blue. In this example, the slicer contains a list of all regions. Just like filters, only selected items are used in the pivot table. The pivot table will instantly reflect the changes when you select or deselect the items. We can also select multiple items from a slicer by pressing and holding the Control key on the keyboard. One of the best things about Slicer is it can easily drill the available data. When we select or deselect items, the pivot table instantly reflects the changes. Now that you have learned how to create pivot tables, perform custom calculations, and apply filters to it, let us do a small exercise to reinforce the concepts. We will provide you step-by-step assistance to do this exercise. Let's start working on this together. Consider the given organization sales data, which includes the following data fields: transaction ID, location, date item, salesman, units sold and amount. You are the sales manager of an operational team in the organization. You're required to create a pivot table, which depicts the following: the net quarterly sales at each location, and the average number of sales at different locations. Also add a calculated field that depicts the incentive for each salesman. The incentive of 5% should be given to a salesman if the sales amount is greater than $200. Else, no incentive is given. Finally, add a slicer to filter the data location-wise. Let us consider the given data to create a pivot table which depicts the net quarterly sales of each location and the average number of sales at different locations. In order to do this, add a calculated field that depicts the incentive of each salesman. If the sales amount is greater than $200, an incentive of 5% should be given to the salesman, otherwise no incentive is given. Let us look at the steps involved in creating this pivot table. The first step is to open the file PivotTable.xlsx. Next, choose the complete data. Now click on Insert and then click on Pivot Table. In the field chooser, add dates to rows. Next, add net sales to values. Now add location to columns. After adding it, right-click on Dates in the pivot table. Choose Group and select years and quarters together. Now click on OK. In the field chooser, add net sales to values. Now, click on the net sales values and drag it to the list of Summarize Value field by list. Then, click on the pivot table. Click Analyze and insert Slicer. Click on Location on the field list. The field slicer allows the user to filter the data. Now, click on the pivot table. Click on Analyze tab. Click on Fields, Items and Sets. Now, choose Insert Calculated Field. Then, type field name as incentive. And the last step is to type is equal to if of net sales greater than 200, 0.05 times of net sales, 0 in the formula box. Michael can now analyze data using the pivot table in Excel. He learned that pivot tables are used to summarize, analyze, explore, and present the data in the form of a table. Grouping data in a pivot table can help to show a subset of data to be analyzed. In a pivot table, summary functions in value fields can be used to combine values from the underlying source data. Formulas can be created in the calculated fields and calculated items. And finally, he learned that slicers are easy-to-use filtering components that contain a set of buttons used to quickly filter the data in a pivot table.